Welcome to the first day of the Latino Media Summit. There are 3 amazing days of programming. To be honest with you, I'm not sure how I'm going to get my work done because there's so many great panels and speakers, and I get to be part of one of them this evening. I'm Felix Contreras, host of NPR Music's Alt.Latino. Just by way of background, since we are talking about media, I've been doing Alt.Latino for almost 11 years now. I have 20 years with NPR, and I've been in journalism just about 40 years, a little over 40 years now. I've worked with NBC, I've worked with Univision, and I started with an NBC affiliate in Fresno, California. And we're here to map Latinidad through music in 50 minutes.
Simple task for anyone.
Yeah. I'll explain, but first let me introduce our panelists, 2 journalists I'm totally in awe of. Suzy Exposito, formerly with Rolling Stone and now with LA Times. Suzy, welcome.
Thank you, Tío Felix.
And Isabelia Herrera, formerly with Remezcla, and now you're going to tell us?
Yeah, so I just finished being a contributing editor at Pitchfork. I'm going to start a fellowship on Monday in arts criticism at the New York Times. So
look at that. There you go. Right on, man. Okay, it's a broad subject. You know, we talked a little bit about this the other day. But I think you each have your own perspective. So I'm just going to throw it out there, right? You know, just for like, if you can just kind of capsulize it, how does music reflect Latinidad? So broad, right? Suzy, you get to go first.
Oh, wow. I'm in the hot seat. I think that music is our culture. Music is like the DNA of our respective cultures, because I think that when talking about Latinidad, I think it's important to recognize that, like, it's not one culture. Like, we don't have a monoculture in Latin America. And that's a narrative that's largely been propagated in the United States just to make things convenient and marketable. And one of the greatest pleasures of like what I do in writing about Latin music is digging into the different facets of what encompasses Latin American music and culture, and translating it for an audience that may not be familiar with it, if at all. So yeah, that's how I see it.
Isabelia.
Yeah, I mean, I very much agree with Suzy that like Latinidad is like a very broad term. You know, we're seen as like a monolith here. But I think like something that I've tried to do in my work over the last few years is kind of like question like what the category of Latin music is, like, and how it's been marketed over the last, 20, 30 years. And so I think like, seeing music as like an extension of our culture, yes, but also knowing that like it's a space for identity exploration. It's a space for exploration of gender, a space for exploration of issues of race, So I think all of that is encompassed in that big category.
Yeah, lots of stuff to hit on, and it is a broad subject. Having said that, now what is your method individually? What is your method for picking stories to cover that reflect that perspective? Isabelia.
Ooh, that's a hard one.
I didn't send the questions ahead of time.
Well, I think there's a variety. So I think ever since I started writing about music professionally, I've, I guess I would be considered like a specialist in like Latin music, however we wanted to define that. However, I think what I've tried to do again in the last few years is like show how broad of a category that is. Like for me, I am very selective like about being diverse with genre, like being diverse with geographical like origin. Like there is a sort of like monolithic understanding of Latin music as like salsa among like Anglo media. And I think something that I really want to do is to challenge that and to like understand that, we're making all different kinds of music and like all different kinds of genres. And it's like, just because it doesn't fit into this stereotypical or like hegemonic idea of what Latinidad is, doesn't mean that it's not valid and not worth covering. So,
Suzy.
I definitely try and take the same approach. I feel like it also depends on where I'm writing, you know, and I'm someone, I've had the privilege to be a staffer at multiple publications, being a full-time staffer at multiple publications. And with that in mind, it's like, I don't necessarily always have the liberty to be like, okay, I'm going to pick the most like underground, experimental artist, you know. I find that as much as I would like to go there sometimes, I haven't always been afforded the opportunity to do that. I would give people chances every once in a while, especially when I was an editor at Rolling Stone. And more specifically, when I was editing the Latin music section at Rolling Stone, which I founded in 2018. And it was specifically for this purpose, was for just raising the profile of artists who were doing interesting things in the Latin music space, and not just like churning out hits. You know, I think that oftentimes, like, and I think I'm not sure if this is something that's like that exclusive to like the United States music industry, but I think that music writing in the US, we tend to, especially online, I think it's all too easy to rely on people who are going to get you the most clicks on a website. Like, and listen, I'm here today not to like, I'm not the Wizard of Oz. I'm pulling back the curtain because there is a lot of like, I think mythology around like the music industry, and people have all kinds of ideas about how it works. And I'm here to like be transparent about the fact that while I'm always someone who was like a curious music listener. I don't think you can be a music journalist without having a baseline level of curiosity about music. And I think that that's what separates us from people who, you know, like stick to one genre and they only want to write about that one thing. I can speak for all of us when I say that I think that we're all kind of like our music taste between three of us is like very expansive, but it's because we genuinely love music. However, getting back to the question, how I find, you know, how I decide what I'm going to cover, not always up to me. And that's reality in the world of journalism. Right. But I try and go for people who are doing things that are interesting and newsworthy, people who aren't just riding the coattails of whatever the trend is, of whatever's selling records. I really try and go in that direction. People who are breaking ground, that's who I'm interested in. So I really try and stay faithful to that. But every once in a while, I got to pay my dues and write about, you know, whoever topped the Billboard Hot 100.
You know, and that's something that that was the follow-up question. You guys both have included that in the answer there. But the follow-up question was going to be, how do you approach the balance of popularity versus the artistic, assuming that there's a difference? And my example is what we've been doing on Alt.Latino. You can just do a line, like there was Alt.Latino before Despacito and Alt.Latino after, right? Because like we started to realize that it was such, we didn't do a lot of pop stuff before that, right? We started it, you know, 10 years ago, 11 years ago, Jasmine Garston and I, we were very intent on Latin alternative. That was our groove. That was our thing, our mantra, right? But then as this thing started to become such a big deal, right? Despacito, you know, it was more than music. It was sociological. It was the mainstream crossing over to the Latin. That's how we all covered it, right? That's the whole thing. So that, but now, like, we're still in this place of, like you said, like, okay, who are we going to cover? Who are we still going to do this? And how do we balance bringing in some of the more popular artists with, you know, El Lado Negro, for example, right? You know what I mean? So I'm just wondering how you balance that.
It's a hard balance to strike. I do think, like, from like a critical standpoint, I think I'm frankly much harder on the pop stars in my writing. I just think there's they have a lot more resources and a lot more infrastructure to rely on than a lot of other like independent Latinx artists do. But I think like there's a difference between covering like Latino pop stars or like reggaeton superstars from like a sociological perspective versus like doing criticism of, you know, like an independent artist. And so I think like for me, I often find myself like going towards that like sociological perspective, going towards that like cultural historical perspective when writing about them. Like, how does this reflect changing conversations about identity, like within Latino communities, or like, how does this challenge this narrative of like boom that we've been fed so often by like Anglo media over the last few years? And yeah, kind of just like trying to push the envelope in that way a little bit, I think is important.
Do you, either one of you, have like, how do I say this? Like, who are you, like, do you have these genres or these artists or this little corner of the music world that are your favorite, that you're always like, oh my God, I love this, but maybe it's not so widely, you know, maybe your editors wouldn't go for it, right? Is it like, for example, I really dig all of these Latin American artists who are mixing like folk music with electronica, right? All this stuff like ZZK, all this stuff down in Argentina, right? All that stuff. I love that stuff, man. This soundscape stuff, right? Yeah. I can't keep, featuring them because people are going to get tired of it. But I mean, like, what are your little nuggets, your little corners of the world that your personal favorites?
I love the intersection between, like, how do I put this? Basically, anything punk, anything loud.
How do I put this?
I just like loud music. I don't know how else to put it. And I did not always write about Latin music. I'm someone who, you know, when I was like an emo kid in high school, I still like rocked out to Juanes, you know. I loved Shakira's like rock era. But like I came in, like I started writing about music like almost 10 years ago, actually. And I was writing at Rookie Mag, which was like a magazine for teen girls. And so I wrote about a lot of stuff that's like kind of nostalgic now. You know, I wrote about a lot of weird indie rock and punk stuff. And, you know, not all of it was white. That's another thing, is that I constantly, you know, was looking for people of color doing really inventive things in the alternative space. And so at the time, that was like my mission, you know, was to really uncover and also just like debunk the idea that alternative music is for white people or is for Anglo people. I really hated that because that wasn't my experience growing up. So coming to Rolling Stone, I actually, you know, before there was a Latin music section, I was writing about bands like Helado Negro and like Bomba Estéreo, and just like I got to write about some odd stuff. I wrote about, oh my God, I wrote about Jepe and like that whole wave of like Andean experimentalists, like all that stuff I really liked. And I was able to make a case for it at the time because I had a really awesome editor, Simon Vozick-Levinson, who generally loves like weird stuff. And I think just kind of trusted my vision when I was writing for the review section there. And so, you know, for me, I think it's great that like, I don't know. I think I look for all the weird off-kilter stuff that's happening in Latin America. And yeah, I do write about, like I have written about the J Balvins and Bad Bunnies, and they have their own, like, I basically gravitate towards whatever is kind of like a spectacle and something that really like makes like a detour, even if it's like in pop music. Yeah. I can't remember your original question, but that's like where I'm coming from when it comes to my taste.
when you talk about the weird off-center stuff, I mean, I'm thinking of people like the Meridian Brothers from Colombia, right? The band, the man, that dude is so like coming from the other side. What about you, Isabelia? What are your little?
I would say corners? I have like two ones that I really love. I think in the last like few years, there's been this beautiful like movement in the DR and the Dominican Republic of like roots music coming up again, but like I wouldn't say it's exactly similar to what you were mentioning about like ZZK, but it is sort of like reinventing or reimagining like roots music. So like in the Dominican Republic specifically, so like palo, gaga, like all those like folkloric sounds, like Afro-Dominican and Black Dominican sounds. There's just been like an amazing like new community of like independent musicians making music like that, and it's beautiful, and you have to dance to it immediately when you hear it. And then I would say the second one is like I listen to a lot of very weird experimental electronic music, like a lot of drone, a lot of ambient stuff from Latin America. There's like a lot of collectives in Argentina, in Colombia, actually like all over South America, who are making like really interesting electronic music. I just wrote about in Mexico this group called Interspecifics. They made an entire album based on statistics that they got from pollution, and they created like a machine learning tool to create music out of those statistics.
Oh my God.
So, like,
awesome.
There's like really interesting stuff happening. And I'm just like, I'm a big fan. I think being at Pitchfork over the last like year and a half actually has allowed me to write about those kinds of things where some other publications might not. I think Pitchfork just has such like they write about all different kinds of music, so that like I can write about this very weird niche thing if I want to. And there's a place for that. So
that's cool, man. That's very cool. I feel like we should have served drinks or something here, because this is a nice little hang. Okay, but I do want to remind people that are watching. I'm not sure how you do it, but you can ask questions. I don't know if there's a chat room or something available, but there's someone standing by to take the questions, and we're going to do the last 15 minutes of the session to take questions. So fire away and write as many questions as you can, because these are we're gonna have some interesting answers. Okay, I want to get back to talking about music, specifically music writing. There are some artists who say that the music speaks for itself. Okay, and I'm always wondering, does it really? I mean, is there always a need to offer context, to offer interpretation? You know, what is your okay, Suzy, man? You're rolling your eyes. What's
rolling her eyes like crazy.
I just think if you can't explain your own work, then why do you make it at all?
There you go.
And I went to art school for most of my life, actually, from the time I was 8 until I went to art college. I went to Parsons School of Design, actually.
Wow. Yeah.
Illustration. And throughout that entire time that I was in art school, they didn't just teach us how to make the art, technically. You know, we had to, it was like every time we finished a big project, we'd have to get up in front of the class and then explain why we made it. Wow. Explain the methodology behind it, the concept, the purpose, like whatever your intention was, you had to go and you had to defend it in front of other people. So I have no patience when I'm in an interview with somebody and they're just like, yeah, I don't know, it speaks for itself. And I'm just like, no, it doesn't. Like, I'm sorry, I don't think it ever does. Like, and I think that, you know, maybe that's something that makes me kind of like I don't know, maybe a demanding interviewer in a sense, because I grew up always learning you have to be able to explain the method behind your madness. And I think that that is the difference between the artists and the entertainers. You know, if you're talking to an artist, they're going to have some kind of idea as to why, like what they put into their work and what the intent was. So I'm not easy about that stuff. And I wish, and I'm telling you, I mean, if you're a journalist and you're watching that, or if you're a journalist and you're watching me right now, go off on some of these artists, or entertainers, I implore you, do not let them get off this easy. Okay. Don't ever let them just leave the answer right there, because that's not cutting it.
That's great advice, man. No, I'm thinking, I'm with you on that school. I'm of that school, man. You got to be able to, and it's only because, like, as I grew up learning, I had to learn, pre-internet, right? I had to read interviews. Like I remember going to, how I learned about jazz. I went to read back issues of Downbeat in the library at Fresno State, right? Mm-hmm. To read all these musicians, they had to explain themselves, and they had to explain. So they gave the history, the context, and all that. So that's always been like that set the bar, right? So when I hear musicians, same things, like, oh, well, it speaks for itself. You're right. No, it doesn't. Yeah, you got to be able to speak. I don't know. Isabelia, are you going to?
Yeah, I was actually going to say, like, for me, it's definitely like a question of like historical or like documentation. Because I think, people will say like, oh, you don't need to provide context. The music speaks for itself. We live in the digital age. Like, you can just Google anything. But actually, I would like argue that there's a lot of selective forgetting around like music, and specifically like Latin music writing. I don't know if, like, at least in English, I don't know if there is like a really broad like archive that we can return to and like look at, And so for me, it's like, actually, no, the history and context is really important, because like sometimes we're writing about this music for the first time in English because it hasn't been written about anywhere else. Right. And so for me, it's like, no, it is important to like give this context, and like it's for the reader. It's not really for the artist. At the end of the day, I don't know if the work that we do is for artists necessarily. Mm-hmm. So for me, I see it definitely from like a historical perspective.
We work with two constant perspectives, okay? As insiders who are connected to the music, not just professionally. Sometimes often we're personally invested in the expression that we're covering, okay? But also as journalists working for mainstream media organizations, working with editors who may or may not know a lot about the subject. How do you deal with that tension sometimes? How do you resolve that tension whenever you ask, and an editor asks you, well, why is this important? Why is this music important? Why is this artist important? Either way.
Great question. My career.
Because we exist. I don't know.
Yeah.
We don't just exist. And again, I'm coming from the perspective of someone who was like born and raised in the US. My mother immigrated from Belize, and my father's 100% Cuban, but like born in Jersey. Mm-hmm. And so coming from that perspective, like just the fact that I went decades of my life without feeling like my culture, without really like without feeling very represented in most aspects of culture, and especially not in music writing in English, which is the language that I primarily speak, read, and write in. It's just, I think, of course, I don't think representation is the end all be all of everything, mm-hmm. but this stuff is important to archive. It's important to document and listen to, because it's important that we exist, and it's important that we're actually like seen and mm-hmm. heard. That's how I feel.
Isabelia?
Yeah. I don't know. It's a hard question. It's something I struggle with a lot, actually, is like, I really don't feel comfortable like explaining my culture all the time. And I think I have come to a point, now where I'm like, well, this is like if you've been paying attention, like you would know this, mm-hmm. And like mm-hmm. how much explaining of like certain things do we have to do to an Anglo audience? And so for me, it's like, it's a hard balance. It's like, I think it's actually been a great challenge as a writer to like learn how to like speak and write to an audience that knows about this genre or knows about whatever specific artist that you're writing about, mm-hmm. while also like, providing enough context for someone who's coming to this for the first time would be able to understand. And that's like a really great challenge, because like I remember writing about, I'll give you an example. Like I remember writing when Safayera came out by Bad Bunny. I did a track review for Pitchfork, and that was really like a hard balance to strike, because that song has so much history in it. It has so much citation, so much sampling of different genres, of different, just like also just the way reggaeton used to be made, right? And so it was very much like, how do I explain this without losing like the beauty of what this song is, and like losing like how fun it is? And so it really just like had to become like approaching the music from like a perspective of like, this is fun and it reminds me of my childhood. And it's also technically a brilliant song. So yeah, it's a hard balance to strike. I don't think I have like a step-by-step guide or tips or anything. It's like every piece is different. So
that's a good answer. That's great. I have some other questions, but we just got faxed or texted an interesting question that I'm going to go ahead and jump ahead and get to. This is from a guy named Terrence Fraser. It says, how do you feel Blackness, colorism, class, and nationality play a role in the mainstream press in the U.S. in terms of covering Latin music and music in general? How African and indigenous influences are represented or misrepresented in coverage? And where do you think the industry needs to be better? Well, these are a lot of questions. How can lighter skin and white Latinx support and open doors for many of those who are clearly of African descent?
I think it starts with, or it doesn't necessarily start with one entity, but I think a really important thing to think about is we cover the music industry. We cover sales. We cover when an artist gets signed to a label. We cover, when a major label signs an artist and really wants to push them and really believes in them, then yes, we hear about it. But who are these people signing? Whose music is selling? What? And I think it's important. I mean, when we get to the journalism part of it, when we go beyond the labels, the journalism part of it, it's up to us to also be critical and like what we cover and how we cover it. And as Isabelia said before, get into like the sociology of the music, the people who are making it, and the people who inspire it and often get erased. And so I think when thinking about how to cover like music made by Black people, for example, which is it's like Latin music as we know it, a lot of it stems from like Black people and the Black tradition. That's undeniable. You have entire, I think about Cuba, for example, and everything that I learned in studying Cuban music, a lot of it came from Africa. And that's something, if you listen to the Fania All-Stars, like they weren't shy about it. They went to the Congo and performed this huge concert in the Congo. Hector Lavoe sang Mi Gente Celia Cruz was there too, like singing Kimbara. And it's like, where do we think that came from? But there are people who are invested in erasing those roots, and they profit from it. They make a lot of money from, recruiting more like wider artists from Latin America to disseminate the same sounds. That's a reality that they're dealing with, in a lot of American music or a lot of music from the United States. It's the same. We have the same conversation about rock and roll as the conversation we have about salsa and reggaeton. So I think that more and more, it's like, I do think that people are discussing it. Like, I feel like it's been something that I've had to address in writing about reggaeton and in interviewing artists who, they'll be like, somebody like J Balvin or Karol G, they'll be like, oh, but I love hip hop. I grew up listening to hip hop and stuff. And you ask them, what is it, how do they connect to it, or what's their relationship to like Black culture though? And I think that that's something that a lot of artists don't know how to talk about. And even then, if they started talking about it a little too long, like if they go beyond like the one sentence platitude, they might be in some hot water, or they might run into some like difficult kind of realization. But again, I want to reiterate that there are people in the industry who are invested in like erasing Black culture, and as journalists, like it is our job to call it as we see it happening, and make people, you know, or make institutions like the Latin Grammys, for example, question, you know, why they might privilege, or why their voter pool will be more amenable to music made by someone like Luis Miguel over somebody like Sesh. I don't know. Like, I mean, those are my thoughts.
I'm very much with Suzy. I'm like, I think the problem is an industry-wide one. It is not just a question of like journalists. I think people need to understand that like in the industry at large, like there are A&R and managers, because colorism is a function of like the society that we live in. There are A&R and managers who sign lighter skinned Latinos or like only support lighter skinned Latinos. Right. And I'm not saying this is like, it's an implicit thing, just the way that racism and colorism are implicit in our cultures. And so for me, I think as journalists, like we have a responsibility, one, to write about Black artists, Indigenous artists from Latin America, and then also really like critique the industry, the business of music, about the choices that they're making, the artists they're choosing to market and support and sell and sign to their labels. Because at the end of the day, like, you know, we have an important role in terms of like visibility and, you know, what kind of artists get coverage, but we don't have the power to sign artists. We don't have the power to market them. That's like a separate part of the industry. And so I'm with Suzy, and like holding like these institutions accountable is really, really important in my view.
Yeah. And I think that one of the things that can impede this, and I'm someone who, I don't think that I would have, like, quite frankly, I mean, look, like the Belizean side of my family, they're Afro-Latino. Like I have, you know, uncles who identify as Black, you know, it's not, and I mean, it's very subjective, but someone like me, I don't think that I like, just being totally real with y'all. Like, I don't think that I would have been, as, I don't even want to say welcomed, because that's that's not totally accurate. But I feel like one thing that was working for me in breaking into like general music journalism, because I didn't start writing about Latin music. Like one thing ultimately that I do have to own is the fact that like I do have light skin privilege. Like there's no question. And I'm someone who came up like listening to, like I started writing about Anglophone music. I'm someone who people have told, oh, you don't have an accent. That's weird. And it's like, yeah, I don't. Like I grew up partially in the South. So it's like, yeah, that's a weird thing to say, you know? And so while I've dealt with like microaggressions coming up in music journalism, I think it's also like, okay for me to be like, okay, I need to do more work in making sure that like Black people and Black Latinas, specifically Black and Indigenous Latinas, can feel like better represented and listened to. And like, I want that. And I do try and, you know, create more opportunities for exposure to these artists, but also like just linking people up with writing opportunities when they come up. I'm someone, you know, every once in a while I get a request where someone's like, hey, we need a freelancer to like write this article for us. And I'm like, you know, who'd be really good at that? Not me. But not just, you know, not me, but like, oh, hey, I know like, like a Black Latina who would be amazing at this. And that's part of the work that I do. And I could always do better. I think we can always do better.
Yes, it's a matter of being vigilant, you know, and always being the person in the room that's going to raise your hand and say, well, what about this and what about that, and what's missing in this coverage and what's missing on the list of people that we've covered. You know, it's always important to do that. Even within like if you're in a room full of fellow Latino journalists, or it's like, okay, what are we missing? Are we the Afro-Latino thing? Where the geographic, like you said earlier, it's a way to spread out the coverage and be accurate. It's like there have to be people in the room to be able to do that.
Yeah.
I want to go back to the subtitle of the panel is "The Latin Beat as Critical Coverage of U.S. Popular Culture." Now, how do you interpret that? And give us an instance where you have seen Latin music become part of U.S. culture. Like, how do you interpret that? Because I think of people that sometimes people think like they're two separate, right? Latin, but I love that subtitle, "Latin Beat as a Critical Part of U.S. Culture," and I think that's more accepted now, or than let's say when I was first getting started, or when I first started covering music, right, or just listening to music critically. They were always separate, right? There was the music, and then there was everything else. But do you see it happening more and more, where people are accepting the fact that it's part of the mainstream culture?
I would say it's hard, because I often feel like I am approached to write about certain things when it's a topic of like mainstream interest. Like we were talking about Despacito. Like I can definitely, frankly, trace like a before and after of my career, like after Despacito happened. And then, or I was thinking about like when Shakira and J-Lo did the Super Bowl, like those sorts of like moments of like really broad like visibility. I think that is when that's when Latino culture is considered mainstream, or like when it's considered US culture. But I don't know. I don't want to be cynical, but I'm not sure that it's really seen as part of it yet. Like I definitely do think there's a lot of belief that like both in media and both just like on the consumer side, that like this is separate. This is like a niche thing. There's still so much like convincing that we have to do, that like just because this is in another language, like doesn't mean that there aren't literally millions of people listening to this music, in the US. Like, and I think, I don't know, I think it's maybe it's gotten better. I don't know, Felix, you can tell us like compared to, before, but I think for me, it's still definitely like an uphill battle of like trying to explain that this is like part of this culture and it's not like a separate niche thing.
Yeah, I think I think you're right though, and there is a little bit of a perspective, to a historical perspective, because I think about, let's say, like when I really started listening closely, like in 1972, right? I was 14 years old, and there was the music my folks listened to. And then there was stuff that I was listening to, right? Even that was broad, everything from the Allman Brothers to the Jackson 5, right? I mean, there was like a broad spectrum, and they didn't cross, and only, and it's, I don't know if it's kind of hokey, but it is telling that like it wasn't until something like Jose Feliciano's Feliz Navidad, right? When you think about how the singing a chorus in Spanish was accepted. It's still, I mean, even I was a kid, and I'm like, wow, all these white people singing Feliz Navidad, you know what I mean? It's like, and they're playing it on the top 40 radio, it's like, it was a big deal, but it was just like only every now and then, right? It wasn't consistent, and when maybe not until Gloria Estefan and La Conga, or the rhythms, you know what I mean? Like only until then. And it was always separate, but occasionally it would cross over. But compare that to now, I think that more people in mainstream culture, for example, know who Bad Bunny is, right? Than they would have known who Luis Miguel was back when he was, doing his thing, right? It's like, I think that if there's more exposure, only because there's also so much more media, you're getting you're getting exposed to a lot more now. Back then, you know, the 3 TV stations and a handful of AM and FM radio stations, and they were always separate. So I think that there's a lot more spillover, but I see what you're saying, and I agree with you. It can still be very, very, very separate, despite what the numbers say, all the streaming numbers and all the, you know, the download numbers. It can still be very separate. That's you know, that's the old guy viejo perspective on on working that, because it goes like in cycles. And you know, Leila Cobo's book, her new book, Decoding Despacito, an oral history of Latin music, I thought she brilliantly set it up with a series of, I think it was 11 songs, and how they at some point crossed over into the mainstream, right? Julio Iglesias and Willie Nelson, right? Like, that's unheard of, but then it worked in a lot of ways. So all of those were building blocks to where we are now. Like you said, it's still very separate, but along the way there was this history, this little trail. That's my thought. Let's see what else. Okay, let's see if we're up at 6:42. I don't know if we have any more questions. Okay. Sorry, this woman says, sorry for the question, but I'm a big fan. This is, one just came in. This is for Suzy. How was your experience? Wait. So how was your experience interviewing Bad Bunny? She said, sorry.
Fun fact, Isabelia also interviewed Bad Bunny.
Yeah, we both did. Yes,
we both have.
Right. That's what the questioner said. I'm just saying.
He's really funny. He's someone who's genuinely very like strange and eclectic, but very kind, you know. And I think I think that what people find most admirable about him is how true he stays to himself, you know. Mm-hmm. And I think part of that, I mean, I think a lot of that is by design too. I mean, he's always someone who is interested in a variety of things, whether it be wrestling or movies, or I don't know, or cartoons. He loves cartoons. And I think that, or even thinking about stuff like gender and sexuality, which he's been very outspoken of. And like, for me, I'd interviewed him before, actually. I've profiled him 3 times at this point. The first 2 times were for Rolling Stone. The second time was my cover story, which was published a year ago. And for that, like, I couldn't meet up with him in person to profile him because of the pandemic. So literally I spent like 5 hours with him on Zoom. I mean, spaced out, like, you know, throughout different sessions. But one day, I mean, we spent like 3 hours on Zoom. Wow. And he was just like eating salmon and then talking about like drag. Very casually too. Like, I mean, we had a fun conversation. He's someone who I think he's still, I think that he struggles with being super visible. Like, I will say, I think that's something that a lot of artists, I mean, like true blue artists are struggling with these days, is just like the hyper visibility of all of it. Wow. And so I feel like no matter, and that's something to think about with artists, is like when we interview them, like we're interviewing them in a period of transition. We're usually interviewing them when they're about to release something big, you know, when they're about to release a record or even just a song. But we're getting them in the middle of the creative process. And something that I really liked was like feeling like even if I wouldn't see him for like 2 weeks in between interviews, we would be able to continue the conversation. But then he'd be like, you know, I said something 2 weeks ago that I don't feel so good about now. So I would rather like talk about it this way. And he's someone who put a lot of thought into the interview, and also like in how he wanted to be perceived, because I think he realized that the way he wanted to be perceived even 2 years before, like, didn't match the way that he felt when I interviewed him in the middle of the pandemic. You know, he was someone who would hide his relationship status. He never wanted to get into that because that's something very personal and private to him. And then at that point, you know, last year when I interviewed him, he was finally like, yeah, whatever, I'll talk about it. Like, I'm not quarantined alone, but but who's to say that he might not like regret it? Like, he probably might feel differently now that he's like out and about. I think that it's like, it is a huge privilege to be able to interview artists like that, especially like him, who he was like, you know, really, I think that he's an artist who's in his peak, but even that's never good enough for him. Like, I think, I just happened to, I caught him at a really pivotal moment in his life when he was like, not just, you know, thinking about his music, but thinking about his personality, his evolution as a man, as like a Puerto Rican, and like where, you know, the things that he believes most strongly about. And so I felt like it was special to get that side of him.
Isabella, you have anything to add from your experience working with him?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's probably like one of the more honest pop stars that I've interviewed. Like, he actually, it sounds like when you talk to him, it feels like a conversation. It doesn't feel like he's rehearsing answers that he's been trained like by his publicist. Yeah. He's also like equally as goofy online as he is in person.
Yes.
I have like
True.
a very strong memory of eating lunch with him when I interviewed him for GQ in the spring of 2018. And right after his first album came out, a few months after his first album came out. And I have this very strong memory of him like eating, like looking at this plate of chicken that had like no sazon on it, just like bland chicken, and him pointing at it saying like, "Ese pollo parece que es de Michigan." And I was just like, I lost it. I was like, all right, I'm a serious journalist, but also that was hilarious. So.
Oh my God.
Jasmine and I interviewed him when he did his Christmas record, when he dropped that album on Christmas, and we interviewed him just before that. And you know, that's one of the things again, it's just my perspective, is when I'm interviewing people or listening to bands and stuff, because I'm still listening, you know, I'm still listening to bands I listened to 50 years ago from 71. Right? And so some of that, so I'm always listening and like, okay, which of these bands are going to be around in 50 years, right? Which of these artists are going to be around, or at least have that. And he struck me as, you know, a really smart, intelligent young man who had his head on straight and was doing, of course, obviously incredible things. But he just struck me as like really smart. Like he's going to be around for a while on his own terms, right? So yeah, it's an interesting cat. Okay, there's another question from looks like my friend Patricia Guadalupe, who's an excellent journalist here in Washington, D.C. She says there was much celebration when the Latin Grammys became a separate event / category, but now it seems to be marginalized and isolated, and certainly not taken seriously in some sectors. Do you think keeping separate as a niche thing is still a good idea, or has it come to the point to bring it back as part of the larger Grammys? And what do you tell Latino artists who do albums in English, whether they prefer the regular Grammys or the Latin Grammys? The whole separation thing. Good thing, bad thing?
Well, I guess I feel like I'll keep it short because I think we're running out of time. But I think in the particular historical moment when the Latin Grammys existed, it was necessary. Like, it was necessary in that moment to create like an infrastructure of visibility for this music. I think things have changed a lot, and I don't really think it's necessary anymore. You know, I think the problem is still that the main, as I like to call them, the Gringo Grammys. The Gringo Grammys still have like just the few categories for Latino artists or Latino music, you know, and that's that's not enough either, right? It's like, I don't know. I don't have a good answer to this, but I think for me, it's kind of like, how can we create this balance where like language is not a question, like when it comes into this, and it's just like really about like the music and the style and the quality of it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm also putting a lot of faith into the Grammys as an institution when I'm saying this, because I think, you know, there's a lot to demystify about how Grammy nominations happen. That's a conversation for another time.
Yeah. And speaking of which, I'm getting the indication that we have to bring the session to an end, because we are everything's live and everything's happening. So if we run over, it just screws everybody else up. We don't want to do that, because like I said, there's so many great panelists and so many great speakers and stuff. Isabelia Herrera, Suzy Exposito, thank you so much. It was an honor. It's really a lot of fun doing this. I have so much respect for you guys, mad respect. Look forward to seeing your names out there and doing more stuff and just sharing music, man. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Felix.
Thanks
to the Latino Media Summit for having us.
It was fun. We got to hang out.
Yeah. Serve drinks next time. We'll do it in person pretty soon in New York. How's that?
Cheese. Love it.
You're out in California now. That's right.
Come visit.
Homesick. All right. I think we're done. And I think I'm supposed to press a button and then it'll end.